Shana Tova. Noam Schuster Eliassi, an Israeli comic, tells the story about her mother, who used to work as a guide at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem. One day, one of the visitors asks her, "What's the most devastating document here at Yad Vashem?" Her mom pauses for a moment, thinks about it, and says, "That would be my paycheck." We try to laugh, to cope, but we know that the hatred and the violence that is caused by white supremacy, whether from 90 years ago or yesterday, is, of course, no laughing matter. Indeed, just 3 weeks ago, 3 Black Americans were viciously gunned down in a Dollar General store in Jacksonville, Florida. The gunman had a swastika carved into the side of his rifle, and the FBI reported that he had, quote, racist writings and rants that depict a hatred toward African Americans as well as other groups, including Jews and queer Americans. This is only the latest in what feels like a tidal wave of white supremacy that has become emboldened since white supremacists rallied in Charlottesville in 2017. Since then, we've become acculturated to their unique semantics. When a deranged gunman murdered 10 Black Americans in Buffalo in May 2022, some of us were already familiar with the Great Replacement theory that he cited as a motivation for the massacre. That's a term defined by the Southern Poverty Law Center as when white people and white culture perceive that they are under attack from multiculturalism and from non-white races. The so-called white fear of replacement also informs the recent surge of anti-Semitism in this country, like the unfathomable synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, but also in the thousands of smaller incidents that made 2022 the year with the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents ever reported to the ADL. Last year's 3,697 incidents constituted a 36% increase from 2021. I've been wondering recently if I've been experiencing symptoms of grief these last few years, as I've unconsciously marked the loss of the idealistic, multiracial, multicultural America I was raised to build and be a part of. Like an actual loss of a loved one, I've experienced denial, anger, bargaining, and depression in response to the recent violence. According to psychologists, the 5th stage of grief is acceptance. I mention this because I'm actively resisting this part of the grieving cycle. I don't want to accept that white supremacy is a component of American identity. I want to protest and peacefully resist it. And on this Rosh Hashanah, as we think about what the shofar calls us toward in the year ahead, I want to invite you to join me. My thinking on all this shifted as a result of our synagogue's trip to the South last November. One image that I've not been able to get out of my mind was a sign that hung inside the Equal Justice Initiative's Extraordinary Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. The piece was part of a larger display documenting the hatred of the Jim Crow South. The sign had 3 lines of text on it. The first line read, "No black people," In truth, it had the N-word. And the second line read, "No Jews." And the third line, "No dogs." The artifact, which put racism and anti-Semitism on the same sign, shocked me like a thunderbolt. It had never occurred to me that racism and anti-Semitism were related, but I left the museum that day deep in thought about what those biases share in common. They have separate histories and separate narratives of suffering, to be sure, and I want to be clear that I'm not equating the suffering of Black people with the suffering of Jewish people. But I do want to suggest that racism and anti-Semitism are not attitudes that exist in isolation from one another. They are two terrifying symptoms of the same disease, an ideology of white nationalist supremacy, which fundamentally believes that white Christian Americans have a privileged right to be here, which puts them above people of color, Jews, queer people, and many other discriminated against subsections of our population. This connection between anti-Semitism and racism isn't new. It played a pivotal, if little-known, role in determining Nazi attitudes in the early part of the Holocaust. The Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Isabel Wilkerson chronicles the subject in her 2020 book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. Wilkerson writes of her chilling experience reviewing the archived Nazi transcripts of meetings from the spring of 1934 of the committee of 17 men that would be responsible for drafting the Nuremberg laws, which defined who qualified for Nazi citizenship and who was deemed a racial threat to Germany. The Nazis were well aware of American racism, and so they included several German historians of the American South on their committee. And the German press commented on this decision by noting, quote, "For us Germans, it is especially important to know and see how one of the biggest states in the world with Nordic stock, that is, America, already has race legislation which is quite comparable to that of the German Reich." The Nazis looked to America as a guide for how best to create a stratified caste system in Germany, and by basing their work on the racism that had already been institutionalized here, they legitimized their own German system of hatred. Wilkerson notes that the Nazis were particularly impressed by the phenomenon of lynching African Americans, having become aware of the ritual torture and the mutilations that typically accompanied them. Most shocking is that some of the Nazis on the committee thought that Jim Crow segregation went too far in its discrimination. The Germans were struck by American definitions of race, that a person would be categorized as Black if they had a single drop of Black blood in them. Moderates on the committee, if there is actually such a thing as a moderate Nazi, moderates on the committee initially argued that Germany shouldn't need to define exactly who a Jew is. Ultimately, the committee defined a person as full-blooded Jewish or mixed race, depending on the religious identity of their grandparents, but they never went as far as several southern states in defining someone as other if they had just a single drop of non-white blood in them. The story of the committee is a stark reminder about racism and anti-Semitism and their common origin in white supremacy. And to our shock, it is alive and well today. We see it when a president declares that there were good people on both sides in Charlottesville, and we see it in the hate that fueled Buffalo and Jacksonville. We see it, too, in disturbing public opinion polls. In April of 2021, President Biden proclaimed that, quote, white supremacy is terrorism, and that it is, quote, the most lethal terrorist threat to the homeland today. But in the days after that speech, 48% of Americans disagreed with the sentiment, including 88% of registered Republicans. Now, put aside for a moment the partisan implications of that finding and simply consider that there's a significant group of Americans, not 1% on the margins, but a significant subsection of our fellow citizens who don't find white supremacy to be maximally abhorrent. Equally concerning, we are forced to reckon with the eruptions of politically fueled violence that white supremacy is producing. The 2021 attack on our Capitol building, which included ample neo-Nazi iconography, is just the most vivid example of this violence. But I would also refer you to the ever-growing list of violent hate crimes against queer Americans, people of color, and our American Jewish community. They are all part of a longer history of violence that is justified by the belief that white people occupy a privileged position in Western life that must be defended. How do we reckon with all of this Jewishly? I raise a question on Rosh Hashanah, which marks the anniversary of the story of creation. Kitzur Baal HaTurim, a commentary from 14th century Spain, reads the word Adam in Hebrew, meaning human being, as an acronym for the Hebrew words Ether, Dam, and Mara, meaning ash, blood, and bile. Though we're uncomfortable accepting it, the fact is that some of our fellow Americans are capable of producing ether, dam, and mara. Their words and their violence unleash immense harm and suffering in our world. But humans are not just producers of ash and blood and bile. Just as we can unleash darkness, so too can we unleash infinite quantities of light. Every time we express compassion or generosity, the hatred of this world encounters its opposite, the forces of love and kindness that can bring us together. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory courageously wrote these words in the aftermath of 9/11. Can I recognize God's image in someone who's different? Can we create a paradigm shift in which different ethnic and religious groups, and I'd add different skin colors, exist in close proximity together? Can we create a paradigm shift through which we recognize that we are enlarged and not diminished by the uniqueness of other people? Dr. King spent his career and ultimately gave his life for an idea that he called the beloved community, fiercely working for a world in which conflict could be resolved peacefully rather than with violence. This is the work of healing and repair that the shofar calls us toward in 5784. Combating white supremacy by becoming an anti-racist and standing up to anti-Semitism is something that we can each do, of course, in our own individual lives. But today we also affirm that our congregation is singularly committed to doing this work communally. and we hope you'll join us in this sacred effort, in this peaceful resistance in the coming months. We're doubling down on our partnership with ADL as part of their signature synagogue program. ADL experts facilitated learning for our teens and adults last year, and more is planned in the year ahead. On your way out this morning, you might also pick up one of the pins that is available, part of the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism's #StandUpToJewishHate campaign. Displaying the pin is one way for you to show your commitment to shutting down anti-Semitic hatred online. More resources about the campaign will be shared in the coming days. Our own experience of anti-Semitism calls us to fight the other expressions of white supremacy as well. Members of our Racial Justice Working Group have been collaborating closely with Cantor Becker and myself to devise meaningful opportunities to enable our congregation to stand up to white supremacy and racism in the new year. Our first phase of work includes a facilitated book series to broaden our learning. Later this fall, Cantor Becker will be trained as a facilitator in the curriculum entitled Dismantling Racism from the Inside Out. With that training, she'll be teaching a springtime course for those who want to deeply reflect about the intersection between Jewish ethics and racial equity, diversity, and inclusion training. All of that will lead to the convening of a unique facilitated dialogue with a local community of color during the 2024-25 school year. We're in the early stages of planning that effort, which will include story sharing, building new friendships and alliances, and working together to dismantle hate in our midst. More details will follow in the coming weeks and months, but please be in touch if you're interested in getting more involved. Getting involved. That's what this day is all about. Rosh Hashanah is calling us off the sidelines because we are unwilling to accept the world as it currently is. We cannot help but imagine something different, something better. In 1932, Albert Einstein escaped Germany before the worst of the Holocaust. He was grateful to find an America that was largely free of anti-Semitism, but he could not accept the persistence of racism here, and he described racism as, quote, the worst disease afflicting this country. A few years into Einstein's tenure at Princeton, the black opera singer Marian Anderson was invited to perform. And the local press raved of her performance, but the Nassau Inn in Princeton would not give her a room. Incensed, Einstein and his wife invited Marian to stay with them, and they became lifelong friends in the process. When Einstein was asked about his friendship with Anderson, he noted, quote, being a Jew myself, perhaps I can understand and empathize with how black people feel as victims of discrimination. And he went further and said, the separation of the races is not a disease of the colored people, but a disease of the white people. I do not intend to be quiet about it. On this Rosh Hashanah, in which we dedicate ourselves to partnering with God to create the world anew, we affirm that we will not be quiet. We will lift our voices and work for a better world. And like Dr. King, we will not stop until the words of the prophet Amos are fulfilled. Vigal kamayim mishpat. On that day, when justice wells up like the mighty waters, utzdaka kanachal etan, and righteousness rolls down, and it flows like an unfailing stream. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May this be God's will.
I'm not quite ready for the choir yet, but come back in a moment. Before we hear from the choir, as we take this message to heart, we know that in Jewish tradition, we talk about many kinds of gates. The gates of prayer, we say, are always open. The gates of teshuvah or repentance are open wide at this season in particular. And there are also the gates of justice, which we know all too well have a tendency to be neglected. The psalmist reminds us to head towards those gates, and when we see the gates of justice closed off, it is our responsibility to open them up, work for justice, and give thanks to God for the ability to do so. So if the tech folks will put the words up, I'll invite you to join me as you learn Pitchu li Sharei Tzedek, open for me the gates of justice, Avovam Odeya, I will enter them and offer my gratitude to God. Open the gates of justice, open the gates for me, open the gates of righteousness, peacefully, open the gates of freedom, tell me what are we waiting for, peacefully, Sharei Tzedek, Avovam Odeya, peacefully, Sharei Tzedek, Avovam Odeya, peacefully, Sharei Tzedek, Avovam Odeya, peacefully, Sharei Tzedek, Avovam Odeya. Lock up the gates of hatred, throw away the key, open the gates of justice, peacefully, open the gates of tomorrow. Yes, we've traveled oh so far, peacefully, Sharei Tzedek, Avovam Odeya, peacefully, Sharei Tzedek, Avovam Odeya. Open the gates of justice, open the gates for me, open the gates of righteousness, peacefully, open the gates of freedom, tell me what are we waiting for, peacefully, Sharei Tzedek, Avovam Odeya, peacefully, Sharei Tzedek, Avovam Odeya, peacefully, Sharei Tzedek, Avovam Odeya, peacefully, Sharei Tzedek, Avovam